Picture this. It's the 9th century in Scandinavia. The sun has disappeared below the horizon, and it won't return for months. The temperature has plummeted to minus 20 degrees Celsius. Howling winds tear across the frozen landscape, carrying snow that cuts like tiny blades of ice. This is the Norse winter, a season so brutal that survival itself was an achievement. Yet, the Vikings not only survived these conditions, they thrived. They explored. They built. They raised families. And they created one of history's most remarkable civilizations in one of the world's harshest climates. Tonight, we're going to uncover the ingenious methods, technologies, and cultural practices that allowed the Vikings to conquer the cold. From their revolutionary clothing to their architectural innovations, from their diet to their social customs, this is the story of how the Vikings survived cold nights. The Vikings understood something fundamental. You don't fight the cold, you build against it. And it all started with the longhouse. Imagine stepping into a Viking longhouse on a frozen winter night. The first thing that hits you is the warmth. Despite the raging blizzard outside, inside, it's surprisingly comfortable. How did they achieve this? The typical Viking longhouse was a masterpiece of practical engineering. These structures were typically 50 to 100 feet long and 15 to 20 feet wide. But size wasn't what made them special, it was how they were constructed. The Vikings built their walls using a technique called wattle and daub. They would weave flexible branches between upright wooden posts, creating a lattice. Then they'd plaster this framework with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. Yes, you heard that right. Dung. This might sound primitive, but this combination created a remarkably effective insulator. The roof was equally ingenious. Layers of turf, living, grass, and soil were stacked on wooden supports. Some roofs were more than a foot thick. This living roof did something remarkable. It breathed. It allowed moisture to escape while trapping heat inside. In summer, the grass would grow, adding extra insulation. In winter, the snow would accumulate on top, adding even more insulating layers. But here's what made the longhouse truly brilliant. Its design maximized communal heat. The entire extended family, sometimes 20 or 30 people, lived in one open space. Humans generate heat, about 100 watts per person when resting. 30 people? That's 3,000 watts of natural heating, equivalent to 3 modern space heaters running constantly. The floor was another crucial element. Vikings would dig down slightly below ground level and pack the earth hard. This semi-subterranean design meant they were building into the Earth's natural insulation. The ground temperature, even in Arctic conditions, stays relatively stable a few feet down, usually around 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. And then, there was the hearth. The central long fire pit ran down the middle of the house. This wasn't just for cooking, it was the heart of survival. The fire burned continuously from autumn until spring. Vikings would bank it at night, covering the coals with ash to keep them smoldering until morning. The smoke? It had to go somewhere. Vikings didn't have chimneys in the modern sense. Instead, they had a small opening in the roof. This created natural ventilation. Cold air would enter through small gaps near the floor, get warmed by the fire, rise, and escape through the roof. It was smoky, yes, but that smoke served a purpose. It treated the roof timbers, preventing rot and discouraging insects. But you couldn't stay inside forever. Vikings needed to work, hunt, travel, and fight. even in winter. Their survival depended on what they wore. Viking clothing technology was sophisticated, based on a principle that modern outdoor enthusiasts would recognize immediately: layering. Let's dress a Viking for a cold night, layer by layer. Layer 1. Against the skin, both men and women wore a long linen undertunic. Why linen in winter? Because linen wicks moisture away from the skin. This is critical. Wet skin loses heat 25 times faster than dry skin. The Vikings understood this instinctively. Layer 2. Over the linen, a wool tunic. But this wasn't just any wool, it was specially prepared. Viking wool came primarily from Norse sheep, a hardy breed with an outer coat of coarse, water-resistant fiber and an inner coat of soft, insulating fiber. Women would process this wool carefully, sometimes washing it in stale urine. The ammonia helped remove lanolin and oils, making the wool better for spinning, but they'd leave just enough lanolin to maintain some water resistance. Layer 3. Wool trousers for men, or a long wool dress for women, covered by a woolen apron. Again, multiple layers of wool, each trapping air nature's best insulator. Layer 4. Over everything, a thick wool cloak. These cloaks were essential technology. The best ones were made from vadmal, a thick, tightly woven wool fabric that the Vikings produced on their upright looms. Vadmal was so valued that it was actually used as currency in Iceland. Some cloaks were made from fur, bear, wolf, or seal, but wool was more common because it stays warm even when wet. Now, here's something fascinating. Vikings used brooches to fasten their cloaks, but these weren't just decorative. The position of the brooch was strategic, usually on the right shoulder for men. Why? Because it left the right arm free to draw a weapon while still keeping the cloak secure. The cloak could also be quickly thrown back over the shoulder in an emergency. For the extremities, the hands, feet, and head, Vikings had specific solutions. Mittens were more common than gloves because they keep fingers together, sharing warmth. They were made from wool or animal skin, often with the fur on the inside. Footwear was crucial. Vikings wore leather shoes or boots, but the key was what went inside them. They'd stuff their shoes with dried grass or moss. This served multiple purposes: insulation, moisture absorption, and cushioning. They'd replace this stuffing daily. Some Vikings also wrapped their feet and lower legs in wool strips called winnings before putting on their shoes ancient wool socks. Headwear was equally important. Despite what Hollywood shows us, Vikings didn't wear horned helmets for everyday wear. For cold weather, they wore wool caps, sometimes lined with fur that covered the ears and could be tied under the chin. Here's something we rarely think about. Vikings also protected themselves from inside out. They understood that you could dress perfectly, but still suffer in the cold if you weren't properly fueled. Which brings us to surviving a Viking winter required thousands of extra calories. Your body is a furnace, and in the cold, that furnace needs constant fuel. The Viking diet in winter was deliberately high in fat and protein, exactly what human bodies need to generate heat. Let's look at what a typical family might eat on a cold winter night. First, there was meat. Vikings preserved meat by smoking, salting, or drying it during autumn. Lamb, pork, beef, and game would be stored for winter consumption. They'd also preserve fish, cod, herring, and salmon, usually by drying or smoking. Dried cod, called stockfish, could last for years and was so hard you had to beat it with a hammer before soaking it to make it edible. But here's what's fascinating. Vikings consumed massive amounts of fat. Seal blubber, whale blubber, and pork fat were prized. A single tablespoon of fat contains about 120 calories and generates heat during digestion. Vikings would render animal fat into lard and add it liberally to their stews and porridges. Dairy was another cornerstone. Vikings were expert dairy keepers. They'd preserve milk as skyr, a thick fermented dairy product similar to yogurt or as cheese. Both could be stored through winter. They also churned butter. And here's a clever trick. They'd bury butter in peat bogs, where the cool, anaerobic environment preserved it perfectly. Some of this bog butter has been discovered by archaeologists, thousands of years old and still technically preserved. Grains provided carbohydrates. Barley porridge was a daily staple, often cooked with milk or water and flavored with butter, honey, or dried berries. Bread was made from barley or rye and would be baked in large batches and stored. But Vikings needed more than calories. They needed vitamin C to prevent scurvy during the long months without fresh vegetables. Their solution? Fermented foods. Sauerkraut, made from cabbage, fermented fish, and preserved wild plants, retained vitamin C even after months of storage. They also had drinks that provided calories and warmth. Mead fermented honey wine was common at feasts, but for daily consumption, they drank ale, a low-alcohol beer made from barley. Even children drank ale because it was safer than water and provided calories. Now, here's the social aspect. Winter meals were communal affairs. The family would gather around the hearth, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. They'd eat from a common pot, using wooden bowls and spoons. The act of eating together wasn't just about nutrition, it was about sharing body heat, stories, and strengthening social bonds that would help everyone survive until spring. The wealthiest Vikings might also have exotic spices, pepper, cumin, or imported honey brought from distant lands. But even the poorest families had access to wild herbs, like thyme, juniper berries, and wild garlic, which added flavor and vital nutrients to their winter diet. We've mentioned the fire several times, but let's talk about just how central it was to Viking survival. The fire wasn't just a heat source, it was life itself. Maintaining fire was such a critical skill that it was taught to children as soon as they could safely handle the tools. Every member of a Viking household knew how to start and maintain a fire because their life might depend on it. Vikings started fires using the strike-a-light method. They'd strike a piece of iron against flint, directing the sparks onto tinder, usually charred cloth, dried moss, or fungus. A particular fungus called touchwood, treated with urine or saltpeter, would catch a spark and smolder. They'd then carefully nurture this ember into flame using dry grass or wood shavings. But here's the clever part. Vikings rarely let their fires go completely out. In each longhouse, someone was responsible for banking the fire at night. They'd arrange the wood, cover the coals with ash, and reduce the airflow. In the morning, they'd simply uncover the coals, add kindling, and blow gently to restart the flame. What did they burn? Primarily wood. But not just any wood. Vikings knew their trees. Birch burned hot and clean. Oak burned slowly and provided long-lasting heat. Pine was avoided for indoor fires, because its resin created dangerous creosote buildup. In treeless areas like Iceland, they burned dried peat or animal dung, both of which, when dried properly, burned surprisingly well. The fire pit ran down the center of the longhouse, raised slightly on a foundation of stones. These stones served multiple purposes. They contained the fire, radiated heat, and could be heated and wrapped in cloth to create bed warmers. Around the fire, Vikings would dry wet clothing, cure meat, boil water for washing, and prepare meals. But the fire was also the social center. This is where stories were told, where laws were discussed, where children learned from their elders. The fire was democracy, education, and entertainment, all in one. Vikings also understood fire safety. Despite living in highly flammable wooden structures, house fires were relatively rare. Why? Because everyone understood the danger and the protocols. Water was always available in buckets. Fire tools were accessible. And most importantly, someone was always awake and tending the fire. It was never truly left unattended. In the deepest winter, when the sun disappeared for months in the far north, the fire also provided light. Oil lamps, shallow stone or metal dishes filled with fish oil or animal fat, with a twisted rag as a wick supplemented the firelight. But these were used sparingly because fuel was precious. We've covered the practical aspects: shelter, clothing, food, and fire. But Vikings had another crucial survival tool: each other. The Norse winter was long. In the far north, the sun would disappear for months. Seasonal depression, what we now call seasonal affective disorder, must have been a real threat. Vikings combated this through social cohesion and cultural practices. The longhouse wasn't just physically warm, it was socially warm. Multiple generations lived together. Grandparents, parents, children, and sometimes extended family or workers. This wasn't always harmonious. Tensions existed, but it meant that people were rarely alone. Isolation is deadly in extreme cold, both physically and psychologically. Vikings used the winter months for indoor crafts. Women would spin wool, weave cloth on upright looms, and create intricate embroidery. Men would carve wood, make tools, repair equipment, and craft jewelry. These activities served multiple purposes. They produced necessary goods, they kept hands busy, and they provided a sense of purpose during the dark months. But perhaps most importantly, Vikings told stories. The winter was the traditional time for saga telling. Elders would recount tales of gods and heroes, of distant voyages and ancient battles. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were cultural education, moral instruction, and historical record, all woven together. A good skald storyteller, or poet, was highly valued because they could help a community pass the long, dark hours. Vikings also held feasts during winter. These weren't frequent resources, were precious, but several times through the winter, families would come together for communal celebration. They'd share food, drink, mead and ale, tell stories, play games, and sometimes hold athletic competitions indoors. These feasts broke the monotony and gave people something to anticipate. Midwinter was particularly important. Around the winter solstice, Vikings celebrated what would later become Yule. This was a time of feasting and sacrifice, marking the turning point when the days would begin to lengthen again. The psychological importance of this festival cannot be overstated. It represented hope, the promise that winter would eventually end, Vikings also practiced what we might call hygiene rituals that helped both physically and psychologically. Despite the cold, they bathed regularly. They'd heat water at the hearth and wash themselves. In Iceland and other geothermal areas, they'd use natural hot springs. Cleanliness wasn't just about health, it was about dignity and maintaining civilization even in harsh conditions. Sleep patterns in winter were different too. With limited daylight, Vikings likely slept more, perhaps in 2 shifts, with a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. During this waking period, people might tend the fire, talk quietly, or work on simple crafts. This biphasic sleep pattern, by the way, appears to have been common in pre-industrial societies and may be more natural to humans than our modern single sleep session. Children were crucial to this social fabric. Viking children weren't isolated from the realities of survival they participated. Young children would help with simple tasks, gathering kindling, helping prepare food, spinning wool. This gave them purpose and skills while also helping the family survive. By the time a Viking child reached their teenage years, they were fully competent in all survival skills. Despite their well-designed shelters, Vikings couldn't stay inside all winter. Animals needed tending, hunting had to continue, and life demanded outdoor work. So how did they survive nights away from the longhouse? For short trips, Vikings would construct temporary shelters. A common design was a snow cave or a turf hut, a small, quickly built structure using available materials. The principle was the same: small space, multiple people, shared body heat. For longer journeys, Vikings traveled during daylight hours and sought shelter at nightfall. The Norse landscape was dotted with farmsteads, and hospitality was a sacred duty. A traveler could expect shelter for the night, not just because people were kind, but because the law demanded it. Refusing shelter to a traveler on a cold night was considered a serious offense. When alone in the wilderness, experienced Vikings would carry supplies: a wool blanket, flint and steel for fire starting, dried food, and, crucially, knowledge. They knew how to read the landscape, find sheltered spots, use snow for insulation, and survive. There's an account from the sagas of a Viking who survived a winter storm by killing his horse, gutting it, and sheltering inside the carcass until the storm passed. Extreme? Yes. Effective? Absolutely. This wasn't common practice, but it illustrates the Vikings' pragmatic approach to survival. The Vikings didn't just survive cold nights, they mastered them. Through ingenious architecture, smart clothing design, careful food preservation, fire management, and strong social bonds, they turned one of Earth's harshest environments into a homeland. Their methods weren't magic, they were the result of centuries of accumulated knowledge, passed down through generations, refined through trial and error, and shared through story and practice. Today, as we sit in our heated homes, we owe something to these ancient innovators. Their understanding of insulation, layering, nutrition, and community wasn't primitive in many ways. It was sophisticated engineering and social organization perfectly adapted to their environment. The Vikings survived cold nights, not through any single technology, but through a complete system, physical, nutritional, and social, designed for one purpose: to keep living, keep thriving, and keep building their remarkable civilization, even when the sun disappeared and the world froze around them.